into the Constitution. Sometimes I ask myself if there's any way that we introduce Constitution to our children in schools, or they probably have to grow up before they learn the Constitution on their own. Is there a way that we can make the Constitution a part and parcel of our lives, that at every point in time we can quote it, use it to defend ourselves, to defend the country, and, you know, help with development? But that's why we're here. Once it's a Constitution Day, we really will not want to waste the day, but help me understand really exactly what goes on with the Constitution. Now, Ghana's Constitution has also been criticized for loopholes that have impeded the effectiveness in the yielding a country's expected good governance and development aspirations. So persistent allegations of corruption, poor quality of leadership, political exclusion, violence, and monetization of politics, coupled with political patronage, soaring unemployment rates, and poverty have made many Ghanaians cynical about the political parties and its multi-party democracy. Now, a constitutional review commission and an amendment of the section of the Constitution didn't see the day of light, or the light of day, following the legal and political disagreement. It is now more necessary than ever for citizens to demand the constitutional amendments and demand for reforms on behalf of the ordinary Ghanaian. So we have the answers right here on Metro TV's Constitution Day Forum, as I am joined by an array of enlightened guests for an in-depth conversation on Ghana's Constitution. I am Annie for Ampofo, and we'll be right back after this short break. My guests will be introduced, and we'll see how we start the day of the conversation on Ghana's Constitution. We'll be back shortly.
Hitmaker TV.
The Democratic Republic of Congo. Hitmakers TV.
I'm from France.
Let's Bright Skandapa with my friend Skirta.
Hitmakers TV.
Keep watching Hitmakers TV.
Hitmakers TV.
Representing Hitmakers TV. C'est bon.
Kwaku Owusu Ajay Pato Abrasamadu Katawiri Wosobrobo Mensa Kwaku Abridi Abrada Sumaya Echimpeni Echimofra Ere agyene bɛkasa problem a ɛwɔ hɔ nyinaa no sɛ yɛtumi hu sɛ problem wɔ ɔman no mu na yɛ problems no nkɔfoɔ de yɛ business nti da bi akwan a ɔmpɛ sɛ ɔmoyɛ ne sɛ ɔmpɛ sɛ problems ne ka hɔ mɛma wadwene nyɛ ɔ sɛ yɛbɛtena bɛkeka nsɛm a ɛbɛma wo tirim ayɛ ɔdɛ deɛ ehia bɛboa ɔman Ghana ho nkɔmmɔ ɛne ɛba bɛdie yɛabrɛ obiara baa no aba bɛka ne deɛ obiara baa no aba bɛka ne deɛ ɛrɛ deɛ nyɛ saa deɛ ɛbɛyɛ ne bio yɛni abere yɛbɛka ne sɛdeɛ si tie biara ama wate ne sɛdeɛ si tie ne kora deɛ minanka de sɛnde ne bluetooth bi ama wo obroni bɛsɛ no matter whose ox is God yɛbɛka ho asɛm dwumadeɛ yi ɛfiri awia no mmienu kɔpem sɛ ɛbɛbɔ no nsia agye ne kasa on original 91.9 FM aha yɛ nyansa fie
Welcome to the 7th edition of the Total Energies African Nations Championships Algeria Chan 2023. Starting January 13th, 18 top African soccer nations will battle it out of their group stages for the cap at the finals on February 4th, including the Black Galaxies from Ghana, who will face Madagascar, Sudan, and twice defending Chan champions Morocco to qualify for the next knockout rounds. Tune in to the station for the best in African soccer as 18 national teams compete in the Total Energies African Nations Championships Algeria Chan 2023. Coming to you live and free from 13 January to 4th February on the station.
International trade and investment law, natural resources law to environmental law at the University of Ghana, Stanford University, also USA. And currently you all know that he's also a member of parliament and serving on one of our committees in parliament, doing a lot, of course. We'll tell you more as we go, but there's also a lot more on the screen, so you can quickly do a screenshot of them, and then you abreast yourself also with the guests with us. We have a fourth guest. At the right time, I will introduce him because he's not with us yet. So, right. So, Dr. Ayeni, thank you so much for also joining us, and you're welcome. Right, thank you. We're actually very privileged to have you in the studios. There's something I know, I won't say it on air, but thank you for coming. Thank you.
But
right.
I have over 26 years
Exactly.
of law practice.
Really?
Yes,
okay,
yes,
so
yes.
I think we didn't update our
You
profile.
didn't update it. You didn't
Thank
update
you.
it. So
Thank you.
it's 26
years.
I also,
you know,
yeah.
somehow when I read the 17, I
Yeah,
was thinking,
and then
no,
you read
it couldn't have been
1995.
less than Joyce
Yes,
Bower's
yes,
own.
yes. So-
Right, it's not possible.
Yeah.
But thank you for the correction.
Okay.
You're very old.
Huh?
You should have said 30.
No, we are like wine. You know, the older the better.
Even better.
Absolutely. That's true. That's true. Anyway,
Okay.
welcome as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to go for a first round of presentation by our guests who are with us in the studio. And I'd like to start with Dr. Emmanuel Akwete. If you do not mind, we'll start with you. So you take us through what you have,
Okay.
and then we'll move on to the other.
I didn't expect. I'm more used to the Q&A.
Q&A
going through it.
questions.
But let me be brief. I think it's commendable we've attained 30 years of multi-party democracy. Many people think that it's just Ghana's democracy or the Constitution, and on Constitution Day, we are 30 years, and it ends there. But I want to underscore that what is remarkable is that we are a multi-party constitutional democracy. And because our struggle for establishing that is what has made it difficult for us to be only 30 years out of 65 years of independence. And that's a remarkable achievement because throughout our history, with the exception of the 1960 Constitution and maybe the Independence Constitution, all the constitutions that had followed, like the 1969 Constitution, the 79 Constitution, and then even the 92 Constitution have been sort of launched by military governments who come under pressure to hand over power. And the military has become, should I use the word, arch nemesis of multi-party democracy in our history. And so we think that at this stage where we now have been able to sustain multi-party democracy governance, it is a remarkable achievement. What is the achievement? If you want to look at it in terms of what I would call the state of democracy in Ghana, in the Fourth Republic, you would find that we've established ourselves in various ways as a leading democratic country or state in not only West Africa, in Africa. First of all, we are a stable democracy, electoral democracy, because you see that our ability to elect presidents take to the two-term maximum limit for the president, not necessarily for parliament. Parliamentarians can run as much as they like. It's quite stable. We've observed that rule of alternation every 2 terms. We've also had the practice of changing government. Sometimes, most often has been the president leaves office and his party loses majority in the House. I think we're getting into our 9th election soon, 24 December, but the dynamics appear to have changed a little since the 2020 elections. We know that Parliament for the first time is a hung Parliament, and one party or one member or MP on both sides not appearing is a huge deal. But it's a good and positive development too. I think we ought to recognize that democracy itself grows evolutionary. You know, it's not a one-time boom. No, it reflects the experiences of the people and their understanding and what they want to do because of the civil and political liberties that they have. So if you're looking at where we are, truly our civil and political liberties have become stronger because without the military, nobody comes in and tells you the constitution has been suspended and all parties have been abolished, you know, and that is a significant development in the last 30 years. But we also have handled our transition, handing over from one party to the other, MPP and DC principally or primarily. Unfortunately, their game has made them, and the experience in government has turned them into the dominant parties, although ideologically the traditions they follow make them dominant. The only thing is that as they've grown stronger and dominated government and parliament when they are elected into office, other parties have grown weaker. So you see NDC and MPP, we call them, they are not just a dominant party, we think they are duopolies. You see, they have so much power and they shape so many things in their own, you know, in ideological and political interests. We've been talking about this, that the emergence of the two parties as duopolies in a situation where, unlike the economy or the telco center and so on, you do not have a regulator, also means that they can get a lot done their way. In the process, our smaller parties are disappearing. They are not represented in parliament and so on, and not in local government where actually political parties are banned, Article 55 from participating in local government as parties. And if you look at that, then our democracy in the last 30 years might come across and interpreted as not a fully fledged democracy, especially in the executive arm of government, where the president has enormous powers. Opposition party like NDC is excluded from contesting local elections and therefore does not govern local districts and municipalities and metropolis. But that has also implications, and that is why we've talked about reform. The winner takes all, and the determination not to lose elections because the consequences are dire. But if you keep parties for more than 30 years continuously out of local government experience, you also weaken their developmental governance capacity, how they put governance, the delivery of public services, the growth of the economy, the unification of the nation, and so on. You undermine it because the competition between the two then, determines everything and changes the course. So many have talked about our parties as election machines, but not seen them strongly as developmental governance machines or development organizations. And it's important that we take that in account. The third point then that I should make is that in the course of the 30 years, we have also shown our weaknesses. There is some fragility. We are strongly stable. Africa is a beacon of democracy. You heard the president talking about that. But a lot of African countries have been inspired by us and have learned from us. Our electoral commission has been all over the place. Sometimes they see how our parties relate in spite of the fierce competition between them, and they wonder, how can you work together, and so on and so forth. We see that not as the structural problem has contributed to they being fierce in opposition, because if you don't win the elections, it's like you're so marginalized, irrespective of the number of followers or supporters you have and the power you wield, whether in parliament or outside. But I think it's significant for us then to see what the risks have been. Increasingly, there's a fragility and the fear of violence, that electoral violence could spill over any time. And the thing about electoral violence is that we do not have a strong track record of those who perpetrate violence, whether in registration processes, whether in presidential parliamentary election processes, or even the assembly elections, local government processes, have ever been brought to book. Maybe very few, one or two, but generally it's a place of impunity. You can get away with it. And as the competition between the two parties have grown intense, violence, especially in local elections, have also grown, but it's a place that you can do it and go, nothing happens to you. In 2020 elections, for the first time, the national election, the presidential parliamentary, we are told 5 to 8 persons were died, lost their lives. We still haven't seen the prosecution going on, but this dates back to 2016, Talensi and other places, Tiwa and all those, So we face this. And if you look at what helps us manage this risk of violence, you have the National Election Security Task Force led by the IGP, but the Army is involved too. And the Army on occasions, especially since 2016 elections, keep warning us that if violence spreads across the country, especially the results of the presidential elections, and people do not accept it or any of the party, and they move their followers onto the street, it could cause widespread violence and fights. And the Army keeps saying that if such a thing happens and the police cannot control, they will step in. They said it in 2016, they said it in 2020. So these are not really good things for us. And at the end of the day, unless we are able to reduce this level of threat of electoral violence, that might cause a coup. We are really not in a safe place. And we need to talk about this and see what will happen. Thirdly, then, I think there have been a number of proposals. The general feeling is that our stability has not necessarily translated into the delivery of development dividends. And if you put it in context, our 30 years also marks the transition, a youth leadership transition, or a transition of leadership to the youth. Because 30 years, if you look at Prof, and he likes to have served on the bar for many years. Just give him 10 more years, and he might say, look, politics, I'm going to and so on. Who takes over? Now, the youth feel strongly that the system has worked well. They vote. They are the majority voters. Youth, women, you can get people living with disability, and you can also get the influence of chiefs in mobilizing to vote in national elections, presidential and parliamentary. But it's not so. It's not the case with local elections. The turnout is bad. And when you ask them, what they tell you, the local people say the local government system is not working. It's not giving them the development goals, the public services they need, the economic growth that will make them find jobs, the housing, healthcare, and so on. And I think it is one of the severest indictment of the system as it exists today, that it's not meeting the development aspirations of the very groups that form the majority of the electorate. And so they still vote in the hope that their party would win. But I think now they are turning around, and we may enter into a phase where we see that the presidency is controlled by one party, the parliament by another. So they have a mind of their own. Nobody steers, it's not the political parties. But the results are showing that they are not happy at all about the lack of development dividends. So the critical question then is, what is going to happen in the next 30 years? How do we ensure that these development dividends are delivered? We have different calls now. Already I'm going to wrap up soon. Already in 2010, after the scare of the 2008 presidential elections and parliamentary, we did 3 rounds to determine the winner by 40,000, And I can tell you, the whole of Africa, because the parties accepted the results, a few conferences are attempted, they ridiculed the whole thing. I imagine I was in Kenya, somebody walks to me, a very top guy, in the conference room and openly walks past me and say, Ghanaians are the most useless political actors. Then I was looking at him, I didn't understand that, and then he pointed at me and said, you people, you couldn't find 40,000 votes to stay in power? You're useless, you're disgracing the whole of Africa. But that is the magnitude of the respect they gave, that it worked. People respected it, we moved on. But I think at this stage, really, many have acknowledged that the Constitution has weaknesses which account for the lack of strong development and sustainable development dividends. And the violence as well. The inclusiveness of the system is not good. It's become quite exclusionary. Our citizenship is undermined by strong partisanship and the play or exploitation of our ethnic divisions and all that. So how do we go at this? And how do we transform the next 30 years into this? There are a number of proposals on the table. First of all, you know that...
So if you pause on the proposals, okay, so that we'll take another round, and then that's what the proposals are probably keeping with my questions. I'll make the lady last this time. They say ladies first, but I'll make her last this time. So Dr. Ayeni, I'll come to you, so that you also take us through.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will start from the point that Dr. Akwete first made about the fact that we've had 30 years of constitutional rule. So we've been a constitutional democracy for a good 30 years. Now, if you take into account what preceded the 1992 Constitution and the overthrow of the first Republican Constitution, the 1969 Constitution, as well as the 1979 Constitution, you would understand that this is a milestone that is worth celebrating. We've done ourselves a lot of good, despite all the shortfalls in the democratic dispensation. One of the things that Dr. Akwete said, which I would want to emphasize, is the issue of stability. We've been a very, very stable democracy. We've had some electoral violence here and there, but by and large, we've stabilized and we've complied with the rule of law and the basic tenets of the Constitution. Now, and that is, for me, very reassuring, because that was one of the aims of the drafters of the Constitution when they issue their report. I don't know whether Dr. Akweti remembers the committee of experts report emphasized the issue of stability. And they did so because prior to their work, we'd had a number of military regimes, military takeovers, and overthrows of our constitution, as I've said. So today we are celebrating Constitution Day, and I think that it is very important that we emphasize or focus on the Constitution, that document that we call the Constitution, which we are celebrating. So Annie, first of all, I would want to clarify certain basic issues about constitutions. So the first thing I want to say is that a constitution or constitutions are foundational legal documents for the regulation of society. And then to function effectively, the foundation must be supplemented by a superstructure. All right, so I will explain what I mean by that. When we say that a constitution is a basic law, it means that it is just a basic, framework for the regulation of society as a whole. The regulation of relations between the structures of government, as well as the relations between the state on the one hand and the citizens, on the other. But the Constitution is not an advertiser's announcement, and therefore it cannot contain all the details about what we need to be able to regulate ourselves, as a country. And so most of the time, constitutions leave the details to legislation, and then in some cases, especially in common law jurisdictions, to judicial decisions that relate to the interpretation of the provisions of the Constitution as they are applied on a day-to-day basis. Now, we must also note that no constitution is self-enforcing. Okay, so it means that the responsibility to enforce the Constitution is entrusted either to organs of the state or in some cases, to citizens of the Republic. So in our case, for instance, we have the right, to take action in the Supreme Court for the enforcement of the Constitution if there are breaches of the Constitution by any person. That includes the organs and departments of state. The third point I want to make is that every constitution is born with some birth defects. Okay, so no constitution is perfect. All right, so, and that is because the drafters of the Constitution, in the case of American jurisprudence, they will say the founding fathers, cannot foresee and make provision for every future contingency. So they would basically provide for what is necessary to regulate society and leave the rest to be filled in by, lawmakers, in parliament, and then, of course, interpretation by the judiciary. The fourth point I want to make is that society is also dynamic, and changes in society may call for new forms of social regulation not contemplated by the drafters of the Constitution. And so, generally, worldwide, there are three ways by which a dysfunctional constitution, if I may use that term, is cured of its dysfunctionality. So the first one is through an amendment of the Constitution itself. Sometimes the amendment will require just a simple majority or a supermajority, two-thirds majority for an amendment to be effected. Or the other way of curing the Constitution is a wholesale replacement. And Annie, just recently there was a Fix the Country demonstration in Tamale. And I think it was on Constitution Day. And some of the demonstrators were asked about the Constitution. And I heard one saying that this Constitution has to be thrown away. We need to replace it altogether because it is not working. And cited an example that I will soon come to, which is Article 71, and the problems with emoluments of Article 71 office holders as a reason why he thought that the Constitution should be jettisoned altogether and replaced by a new one. So in the view of that particular citizen, the Constitution for 30 years hasn't worked. Of course, I believe it goes back to the development dividend, that we are not, the Constitution is not delivering development as quickly and as efficiently as, the citizens desire. The second way by which you can cure the deficiencies of a constitution is through what I call legislative supplementation. All right. Now, that is supposed to be done by Parliament, because Parliament is the repository of all legislative authority. And so, for instance, if you take Article 22, 2 of our Constitution, it provides that, Parliament should enact a law to govern the property rights of spouses. Okay? The Constitution came into effect in January 1993. Okay? We are 30 years into the operationalization of the Constitution, and yet we are yet to enact the law on the property rights of spouses. So, on matters of divorce, for instance, and issues of the distribution of property during divorce, the courts have had to just rely on an interpretation of Article 22, 2 of the Constitution, rather than, have the Property Rights of Spouses Act, which would have dealt with all the issues pertaining to the property rights of spouses when it comes to at the tail end of a marriage. Then also, the last way by which you can cure the Constitution is through judicial supplementation. That is what that's how I choose to call it. Now, our Constitution is very unique in the sense that it vests expressly the power to interpret and enforce the Constitution in the judicial arm of government. Now, earlier constitutions, such as the Constitution of the United States of America, did not explicitly provide for the power of judicial review of legislation or judicial review of executive exercise of governmental power. And so that had to be inferred from the provision vesting judicial authority in the judicial organ of the United States of America in the case of Marbury and Madison, where, the Chief Justice just, relying on the very sparse provision of the Constitution vesting the judicial department with power, said that, it is within the province of the judiciary to say what the law is. And therefore, any act or omission of the executive branch which contravenes the Constitution will be declared null and void and of no effect by the judiciary. And that's how the power of judicial review was inferred from the American Constitution, despite the fact that the Constitution itself did not provide for it. In our case, the Constitution explicitly provides for the power of judicial review of legislation and judicial review of the exercise of executive power. Now, another example that I want to give to highlight the fact that we are not doing very well when it comes to supplementation, whether legislative supplementation of the constitutional provision, the Constitution, or judicial supplementation, is with reference to a clause in the United States Constitution relating to interstate commerce. Now, this is a provision which is in Clause 1. It's in Article 1, I think Clause 3 of the U.S. Constitution, basically vesting Congress with the power to enact laws to regulate interstate commerce. The founders of the U.S. Republic realized that there were 50 states. No, at the time, I think there were 20-something states, right? At the time of the founding, I'm asking Dr. Akwete. At the time of the founding, I think there were about less than 30 states which were coming together to establish the United States of America. And so they thought to themselves that these various states would definitely engage in interstate commerce. All right. In other words, they'll be trading amongst themselves, and then there will be issues regarding cross-border exchange of goods and services. And so they vested Congress with the power to enact laws to regulate interstate commerce. That was all that they did. But what has happened is that over time, as time went on, there were issues relating to the conduct of business across borders, and it was the judiciary of the United States of America that stepped in, and there's been some rich jurisprudence on the interpretation of the interstate commerce clause, which, I think is a very useful lesson for, the Ghanaian parliament. Now, I would want to make some few specific comments regarding our, constitution and the way we've dealt with it for 30 years now. Annie, our constitution, for me, is a very well-crafted legal text. Very, very well-crafted legal text. And I hope your viewer who sent in the text saying that no politician will see anything wrong with the constitution will not take this to mean that I am endorsing the view that there is nothing wrong with the constitution. Certainly there are issues with the constitution, and I'll come to those. But if you look at the constitution and the work that was done by the committee of experts, you realize that they did a fantastic, job, of covering almost, all the ground. I mean, as far as the relationship between government and, the relationship between the arms of government is concerned, and then also the relationship between the state and then the citizen are concerned. Now, I do not wish to imply that it is a perfect document, as I've said. On the contrary, it has its own deficiencies. Some of them are real, others, are, perceived. And I will look at some of the what I call the BEV defects of the Constitution.
Okay, so you have just a few minutes to land, so if you can summarize.
Yes, I'll summarize that very quickly. So the first one is the fact that a lot of people think that the Constitution established an all-powerful executive president. All right, that the president is very powerful, and because the president is very, very powerful, the abuse of executive authority goes unchecked. Now, I take a different view of this matter, and the reason is simply because our Constitution establishes the separation of powers. All right, it vests all legislative authority, lawmaking authority in Parliament. Okay. All executive authority in the president, and all judicial power in the judiciary. But at the same time, it also creates checks and balances. It places constraints on executive authority, and then also, on the exercise of legislative authority. So, for instance, the president cannot appoint justices of the superior courts without recourse to Parliament. And if Parliament decides that a judge nominated by the president is unfit to be a judge of the superior courts, Parliament can reject that appointment. That is an effective check on the exercise of executive authority. The fact that over time, Parliament has always done what the president wants does not necessarily mean that the Constitution is deficient in that respect. Okay,
so these are where the questions actually arrived. I know that you actually started with some solutions, which Dr. Akwete was going there, but I paused him.
Right.
So we'll come back to where these questions are arising. But let me have...
That's fine. That's fine. Yes.
Yes.
There were 13. Yeah, okay. Thank
13
you.
states.
13 states.
Okay, interesting.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Joyce, you can also come.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure that this morning when you spent all those minutes phone convincing me to be here, I told you have two of the very best people, one from the legal fraternity and the other from a very long-standing governance perspective. And I didn't even consider that I was worthy to be part of this conversation. Aww. But be that as it may.
That's an all comment.
I have listened to both gentlemen, and I think that they've actually put the cards very, very, very well, beautifully before the cart. And indeed, let me start by saying that when you read the case of Tufo versus Attorney General, one of the locus classicus cases on the matter of the Constitution and, of course, on its interpretation, a matter that clearly also stipulated and clearly defined the various arms of government. It also defined the letter and the spirit of the 1992 Constitution. It also raised, amongst other things, that one of the clearly very important matters to do with this Constitution is the fact that it is actually a living, breathing organism, one whose interpretation defies a certain reasonability or logic, one that actually provides for judges in the terms of interpretations to actually outline as they go along. It is why sometimes there's a perception even that judges make law. What they really do is to interpret the spirit and the letter of the law to the best of their ability. And they do this through all sorts of ways and means. They take into consideration public perception, primary legislations, secondary legislations, and introduce many other forms. Even sometimes they will invite experts to advise on the matters and how. You know, over the years, and being the daughter of one of the gentlemen who participated actively in the Legislative Assembly that heralded Ghana into this 1992 Constitution, the framers at the time were common people, basically, persons who had lived through all the military regimes that actually had heralded our prior constitutions before the 1992 Constitution. It is not in doubt why this particular Constitution reigns the longest amongst all the other ones we've had. It is as a result of the bitter experiences of the various interventions. It is as a result of the instability that came with the various coups d'etats that we suffered. It is also to do with the lack of longevity and continuity of those specific regimes and why they were mostly unpopular and unsuccessful. It is also to do with the many people who suffered all forms of injustices and actually got no, recourse to solutions or whatsoever. They suffered basically in silence. It is a reason why a certain broad approach was used to arrive at a consensus leading up to the 1992 Constitution. I listened to all the debates really about whether or not this particular Constitution has outlived its usefulness, whether or not it is time for us to topple it and to, of course, develop a new Constitution. But Annie, let me put it very, very clearly that this particular document has served a very useful purpose. That on a day such as today, it actually behoves on us as citizens to celebrate more the positives of the 1992 Constitution, as Dr. Ayine said, to dwell more on what it has given us instead of what it didn't give us, to acknowledge that in the generality of the purposeful approach that was adopted to present this document is one of the greatest reasons why it has also survived the longest. That multifaceted approach, the multi-party approach, the fact that many citizens participated actively in its promulgation may be the reason. And of course, many of those people, even if they're no longer with us, we still have some great individuals who participated actively at the time. And even with the boycott at the time of one of the major political parties, I'm sure you'll notice that very little changed. The Constitution went on as though nothing had happened. All the debates are here since the Government Review Commission did its work. A commission set up by Professor John Evans Satta-Mills of blessed memory. I've also looked at the white paper that the government put together and presented to Parliament. We all know the reasons why it didn't work or why that particular document didn't pass or why we did not even get the amendment that we had all expected or required. But that the young people, the youth, the bulge of our population, the majority, and Dr. Akwete and Dr. Ayine will agree with me that all of the amendments of the 1992 Constitution have dwelt more on executive power, on a need for executive power to be fettered one way or the other, on the fact that this Constitution allows for the executive, especially the presidency, way too much latitude, too many powers that have not been clearly defined. Like Dominic said, even in the 1992 Constitution, there are provisions for some legislations to have been passed to give vent or give teeth or give life to some provisions or articles in this Constitution. And so far, some of them have not even seen the light of day. So certainly, Ghanaians, the majority of us, are particularly unhappy about the level of power that is reposed in the office of president. That is the executive. They look at it from the perspective of appointments, for example. They look at it from the perspective of the numbers of appointees, for example. They look at it from the perspective of the president's, emolument, his salary, Article 71 office holders, the ex gratia in particular, even some of the beneficiaries presently and under our current economic circumstances are actually upset that Article 71 office holders continue to receive this ex gratia. And I remember one of my colleagues who lamented, but it is not even a lot of money. So why wouldn't they just let it go? So far, these are matters that engage the good people of Ghana. In a country whose constitution, 30 years later, has failed to develop a welfare state, a properly documented, well-implemented, clearly executed, one that benefits the generality of the citizens who will never, ever appear or benefit from Article 71. Many people within the private sector will never enjoy anything of such benefits of Article 71. And look at the list of persons who benefit from that particular article. They go right down up to chairpersons of the Electoral Commission. It is a mind-boggling list. It is a list that riles and annoys many of our citizens, especially our young who are currently largely unemployed, for whom current economic challenges affect the most because most of them have not even attained the level of unemployment or even any attempt even to see employment. So for them, any such provision that seeks to take the best of our political class, to celebrate them, to give them the very best of conditions of service, and then at the end of a particular cycle, add on to what people already perceive as the existing benefits of a kind that most people can only ever imagine. Look at the vehicles that go to persons within that category. Look at the security that goes to persons within that category. Look at the privileges in terms of medical attention to the best of facilities catered for by the state. Look at the tax incentives and holidays attached to some of these job opportunities. Above all, the category of persons, look at people like Dr. Ayini, a fantastic legislator, but a great lawyer, a man whom I'm sure by the time he appeared on the shores of Parliament, probably had just about everything that he could even imagine, things that most people could ever dream of and never see. But in this constitution, he's allowed at the end of every cycle to take away a benefit under Article 71. You know, the subject of ex gratia divides this nation. It riles the citizens. It is actually a contentious subject matter. And at every turn of the engagements by the Constitutional Review Committee and its members, Ghanaians criticize the continuous payment of ex gratia to persons within that category. Certainly some persons, for issues of corruption and the fact that in the jobs that they occupy, for example, the judiciary, considering the constraints on their lives in that particular category, maybe they are deserving of a certain cushion for when they leave office. But take the others, whose jobs do not preclude them from working for profit. For example, Dr. Ayini, all he has to do is seek permission from Parliament to take on a client. I'm sure these days he only takes cases that go to the Supreme Court, nothing less. It is why he runs a very successful law firm with many young people working under him. So imagine what it looks like when young people hear that all these individuals receive these benefits at the end of their term. Honey, this constitution has served a fantastic purpose. On the side of history, we will all admit that 30 years later, it is time for us to take a critical look at some of the powers, especially vested largely in the president or presidency. Secondly, some of the executives and what they receive as ex gratia. Thirdly, even in terms of taxation, emoluments, and for them as well, that they are not able even to run businesses in the way that they want to, largely because some of them have come into this category of Article 71 office holders. So yes, I mean, look at the president's right to grant a prerogative of mercy, for example, another bone of contention. We all saw what happened a few years ago, and of course, Dominic is here. He was a deputy attorney general then, and clearly very conflicted. Do we look at the crime? Do we look at the individuals? Or we look at the rights granted by the Constitution?
He seems to have forgotten the case. He wants you to mention.
No.
He will never forget the case. He never forgets anything. So you see some of these things. And these are matters of enormous public concern. Look, in the United States of America, when a president grants a pardon using his right of this sort of prerogative, nobody complains. It could be anybody. It could involve huge sums of money. In fact, sometimes it involves crimes that we don't even want to speak of. Despicable crimes. Sometimes just on the basis of friendship, business association. We've seen all of them. There is another matter. That is our constitutional bodies under the 1992 Constitution. Sometimes, and this might be a very interesting example, and of course my senior, I say, he can correct me if I'm wrong. When you go to the United States of America and you have challenges with an outcome of an election, when numbers do not tally in the manner that you agree with, you go to the Electoral College, ascertain for yourself. And we saw this beautifully in the case of Gore in Florida. In Ghana, we are now putting additional responsibility, not just on members of parliament, but on political parties even, to start to build collation and collate results, like Dr. Akwete said. So imagine that there is a difference of opinion, of numbers, of qualitative issues. Who do you go to? Do you then trust the arbiter, that is the EC, or you trust what you have within your own purview, or what your political party determines as being the case? The body called IPAC, that is our inter-party group that meets with the EC. IPAC has no legal backing. So why should anybody even listen to them? Why should they even continue to participate in those meetings? If there's no legal backing, there's no regulation, there's no law allowing IPAC to work. So yes, I entirely agree with our JSC as he then was, that this is a living document, a living organism. It is one that determines what the rights are in terms of the executive, the judiciary, and of course, for Parliament. What it does is that it does not provide any way that you can serve or provide a limit to those powers or put a cap on those powers. Imagine that one day we have a leader who enjoys power so much that he assumes for himself excessive powers to the point where every Ghanaian feels stifled, feels burdened, to the point where you have individual ministers that for one reason or the other, the public has called out clearly for termination of those appointments or for sacking of those individuals. And yet you have a leader that will refuse because the Constitution says, I have every right to appoint anybody of my choice. How will the youth feel when you have countries such as Canada with youthful prime ministers, France and others? The whole wind of change is actually looking at much younger people. And yet you have a constitution that says that for you to contest as president, you at least must be 40. Some people have built billion-dollar businesses at the age of 25 and younger. Are these portions of our constitution that we ought to continue with after 30 years? So there's a whole raft, a litany of issues.
So let's get into the issues. Now, I think what I'm realizing is that you said that the Constitution was built by very ordinary people, having your father as one of them, but you can tell that even as ordinary as you may describe them, they were a little apart, from the general public. And so they knew better, than the public. And that's why they put the document together. Now, we've gotten to a point where you can tell that this public have now grown and developed faster to catch up with those who actually developed the Constitution. So they can suggest to you that this is wrong, we can't do this, we want to do that, we want to do this, Do you get my point? So I think that is why all the defects, as Dr. Ayen described them as birth defects, of the Constitution are now coming out. So all the areas that have the loopholes, are rearing their heads. But do not think that the Constitution doesn't work, because that's the reason why every 7th December you have to go and queue. And some of you are using stones to queue to go and vote for a president. That is the Constitution working. So it still works. It's very effective, except that we have defects that most of us are, telling our own opinions, and we are hoping that there should be a willpower to make those changes. Now, we will pause here. We'll take just a short break, a breather. Let's breathe on what we have said. We'll be back, and then we get into the discussions of the birth defects of the Constitution. All right, you're welcome back to the Constitution Review. And it's a Constitution Day. I know most of you are spending the holidays at home. Today, when I woke up, there was a lot of quietness in my area. I was wondering if people were still sleeping, or because I know Ghanaians, during holidays, you put party. So why was everybody quiet? Is it because it's Constitution Day? Anyway, so I'm still in the studio with Joyce Bawa-Mutari, who is a lawyer, and then also aide to former President John Dramani Mahama. Dr. Emmanuel Akwete is also with us, Executive Director for the Institute of Democratic Governance, and also Dr. Dominic Ayeni, also MP, and a senior man, of course, in the House of Parliament on 3 different committees as well, has been the former Deputy Attorney General. We're expecting Professor Bafo Ajimandua to also join us, also a governance expert. He's also supposed to be joining us via Zoom. As and when he does, we will. The producers are trying to, link it up with him. I think they're having some technical challenges. As and when, we will definitely let him into the conversation. Okay, I'll come to Dr. Emmanuel Akwete now. I think the defects that we have identified, I think the leading one has to do with the powers of the president, and the very sensitive ones, monitoring, speaking to people, having some interviews, have really dwelled in the area of the president being the one appointing IGP, the president being the one appointing the electoral commissioner or the chairman of the electoral commission. Those have been 2 top sensitive ones I've actually identified. Imagine the IGP saying yes, Amasa, to the president. What else can the IGP do? Sometimes if you're even an IGP and you have to work, I mean, how? How are you going to do the work? So, like I said earlier, the people have grown to a certain point where they can tell you that this is wrong, which is why it now has become a defect in the Constitution. So, I think some more Doctor will add, but let's get into those issues, Doc.
Thank you very much. I think I just want to go to look at the bigger issues and there's various other considerations. My colleagues have spoken about them. I think there is a philosophical underpinnings why we have adopted a system that concentrates power in the president. It's not just the Fourth Republic before. We should remember that they need to build a nation, unite the nation, develop and transform the economy rapidly, catch up with middle-income countries.
Oh. Okay. So we have a.
Let me go on.
Okay.
Was tested. At the time of independence, we were a multi-party state. There were several parties. By 1964, or from 1960 when we became a republic, parties were seen to be divisive. They were seen to be exploiting our identities, ethnic identities, and the way of campaigning. And the primary project at the time of independence was to build a strong state, was to build a nation, unifying us. The Ghanaian, the citizen, being your identity as a Ghanaian, superseded everything that we wanted to create. And the thought then was that maybe if we were able to concentrate power, one party that had the vision of building the nation, unifying us, pushing across development and so on, that position had to be given all the necessary power. And in fact, some still believe that there should be no restraint on the president, who is believed to be the visionary who will transform the Gold Coast into a modern state of Ghana, industrialized, highly educated people. So it was rapid development and an aspiration that will become a state, we're a nation, we're on the country. So Nkrumah's vision itself also informed the definition or the concentration of power. And we still subscribe to the view that giving a lot of power to the center, the one-party state, for example, is what would avoid our being divided much more along our ethnic and other identities, and so on. At the time, it wasn't only in Ghana, across Africa, although Ghana was amongst the first to do that, because from 1960, by 64, this idea that the concentration of power would lead to rapid development, industrialization, transformation, social welfare, our consciousness as a nation, and be part of the Committee of Nations and so on. It was a powerful idea that drove the concentration of power in presidents, especially those who were in the late 50s and in the 60s, the one-party state. So the party and the state had to be joined in the way that many believed it would deliver the development. I think we've learned, it wasn't only in Ghana. Many African countries, Zambia, Tanzania, and others followed. Because when they took over, they realized that the colonial state was more focused on how to export, how to mine or facilitate the mining and exporting of our raw materials, our minerals and so on, and enrich themselves at our expense. They did not develop the social sector very much. Health issues, housing, employment, these were all challenges. But the demand, the dynamic was that people at the time of independence also wanted to see that those conditions would change to their benefit and so on. We've tested this idea not only in Ghana, across Africa, one-party states were established. East Africa, Southern Africa, with the exception of South Africa, apartheid. And then you go into you go into North Africa and others until about the late or the beginning of the 90s. Most countries only knew one-party state and a president with enormous power. After 30 years, or let's say from 1957 for Ghana, or 1960 when we became a republic, to 19 to 1992. Okay. Yes, to 1992. What you saw was that even the short-lived multi-party democracy systems, like under the 1969 Constitution, the 1979 Constitution, and so on, what you really saw was so much power at the center of government and in the hands of the president. Yet the dream, the expectation that the enormity of the power given to you would itself propel you to develop a country, industrialize the economy, unite the nation, and so on, was a fallacy. It didn't happen anywhere. If we were looking at the Soviet Union, or China, the system of concentrating power failed in many cases, such that the Chinese development revolution, got into some cultural crisis. Now they were even targeting educated people who were very critical of the way that economic and social development was going. So there is that belief that do not restrict the powers of the founding father, the founding president, and the more power he or she has, nobody can delay the rapid development of the country. The evidence is glaring. It's not worked all across Africa. If it worked in South Africa, they had to use a lot of force. Apartheid had to be introduced. They focused narrowly on the development of infrastructure, education, and others for the whites. They left the blacks out, and so on. And if you come to Ghana, where we didn't have the system that is clear that racism would be part of it, but in Ghana, we were citizens, we were given the consciousness of a Ghanaian. Your first identity is a Ghanaian, not whether you are a Ghanaian or you come from the north or so on. No, schools we attended, we intermixed. People went to schools in the north came south. Nkrumah was trying to do that project and inspired a lot of African leaders. But it did not necessarily, in the case of Ghana, of course, there was the coup, the National Development Plan that was to bring about sustained transformation. Many things unfortunately, were undermined by other factors. So we never saw the full effect or realized the full ambition of the concentration of power in the president, in the Ghanaian context. It will vary in Tanzania, in other places, but it was the fashion of the time that the newly independent states were in a hurry to develop, to build a nation. Citizenship was more important than everything, but they didn't have, and they lacked the experience for developing, building nations straight from the independence struggle, liberation movements, and so on. They hadn't done that. The colonial structures themselves do not lend themselves easily to this, and so on, and the institutions that had to be built. And you could tell clearly that the urgency of building a strong economy, rapid development, was such that it also created a lot of human rights violations and intolerance of opposition. So, for example, Ghana, by 1964, had become a one-party state. The party and the state were, fused, but it was one party. And civil and political liberties then were suppressed. Others could not form political parties, could not express different identities. But it was a phase of pursuing rapid development under an authoritarian model that failed many African states. We may go into that, but when you put it in the Ghanaian context, we have, after Nkrumah, also seen soldiers coming on board, and the first thing they do is they suspend the constitution, civil and political liberties are repressed, political parties are proscribed, and this strong military men thought without parties, which were abolished, they could bring about economic and social development rapidly. It didn't happen. We've tried all this, and they haven't worked. So the question then is, could we look at how we can develop without this concentration of power? I think the important thing that occurred over the years is that every time power is concentrated in the hands of the military, the one party was one experience. But subsequently, it was the military, the Second and the Third Republics. And yes, the Second and Third Republics were imposed. Okay, the coup in 66 and National Liberation Council, the 1969 constitution came from them, and so on. But all those constitutions were also put in place, designed and promulgated because of reaction to the excessive use of power, the brutality, the violation of human rights. I think there is something in the Ghanaian that in colonial times were established. Civil society, okay, in most of the literature would be acknowledged to be very resistant. They will fight. Their values, they would tolerate, they are not afraid. And at some point, it created so many. So we could not be dominated. As, for instance, you found it happening in South Africa or even in some of the East African countries. So there is something about the Ghanaian nation, the different angles or the different areas they come from, but there is a resistance to domination and colonial rule. But even domination in the modern setting of Ghana, there would be a resistance. People want their freedom, they respect their values, and they want it to go forward. I think that significant change then occurred. In the 1992 Constitution, this philosophy of concentrating power and that will bring about rapid development and so on was still there. You know, some people say that, well, if they hadn't concentrated power in the presidency, late President Rawlings, as chairman of the PNDC, would not have agreed to the transition to the Fourth Republic. I am not sure if it was only him, because he had people in his government who were very strong believers in also liberal democracy. The late Justice Annan, for instance, who believed that, and the lawyers fought. I mean, there was such debate. If you look at some of the documents and the Constituent Assembly issues, you know, what the debate was openly and so on. So yes, ordinary people got represented, but increasingly power to the people had to be translated into sort of reducing the powers that the center had. And to put Rawlings on as the man who would not go or would not accept a diffuse system, a decentralized system, and you only have to concentrate power, I thought was a very deficient explanation. Be that as it may, we've tried this concentrated power. Okay, the 1992 Constitution. Concentrated power, yes. And if you read the CRC reports and so on, CRC, yes, the heading of it was that, yes, we become a republic, we are strong and so on, but in 2010, when they were reviewing, at the time they were reviewing, the dynamics of power relations was also changing. Of course, Rawlings served his term and left, and yet it was also the same people who fought authoritarianism who also decided that they were empowered with the vote. And, you know, I remember I came to Ghana on a research thing around 96, the second elections. And all the newspapers at the time, the Chronicle and others, there was this prediction Rawlings was not going to hand over. Okay, and he was going to do a third term. And those days when I was doing research, I liked doing research in taxis and talking to taxi drivers, trotro stations, and the people, the passengers, and so on. I don't know if it goes on now, but it's a very good area to read the minds of people, and so on. And whilst the elite, like the lawyers, were talking about, you know, the need to preserve this power, otherwise he wouldn't go, and some were predicting he wouldn't go. There were also ordinary people who said, but the Constitution says 2 terms is the maximum you could serve. So while some said Rawlings should not be voted for to do a second term before he entrenches himself, there were also those who said, but the Constitution says 2 terms. After 2 terms, you're done. You're not coming back. You can't be. And when you saw the results of the elections, they believed in that. They gave him the second term, but they also made sure that he didn't get a third term. If you look at the things that happened from the Congress, they had through 1999 and 2000 elections, the people shifted. And it's a pattern, if you look at. So I think putting people at the center, their aspirations and their needs, is extremely important. And when you look at the 1992 Constitution, you look at the components, it was not just a recognition of the civil and political liberties that citizens of Ghana should have, but you also begin to see for the first time, some call it a program, Chapter 6 of the Constitution, the Directive Principles of State Policy. The nation-building strategy changed. You must see citizens in every Ghanaian. You must decentralize power. They must have a share of common fund that will bring women, youth. You can't discriminate, and so on. But we've matured to a point where we knew that the brutality of concentrating all power in one person or one party doesn't have. And the electoral votes were also showing that people had a different view through whatever experiences they've had. So in that case, I think I agreed with the CRC when it came to the conclusion that in the consultations it made, there were one institution that people really everywhere, irrespective of region or ethnicity or something, but acting as citizens, they wanted National Development Planning Commission and a National Development Plan that would transform the economy and give them whatever they needed, which was very interesting. One institution that stood out everywhere. And the unfortunate thing is that the CRC didn't have the time to go back and really educate people and say this and so on. They talked about local government, but, for them, they wanted a machinery of state and institutions and investors who would improve their quality of life and access. And they thought that a long-term development plan should not be politicized. It should be there continuously. They are implementing policies, building institutions, changing the quality of life, and so on and so forth. That's what the CRC reported. So the CRC itself, I think also then came to the conclusion in 2011, after the review, 2010-2011, and said that the Constitution had a strong tilt towards, how do they call it, political. The Constitution was too political, meaning it's been influenced by pleasing Rawlings, and maybe the NDC also played that role, because one of the things they did in the 1992 Constitution that showed that they still believe in this authoritarian thing to do is that, and they identify political parties as the culprits. So Article 55(3), parties can participate in local government. And I think the revolution that followed and so on, it's always joked that NDC thought its strong base in the Fourth Republic would be the local areas and so on, assembly areas and so on. But they started losing elections and people had a different behavior. I think we've not studied...
I think it was one of the 97 articles that were expected to be reviewed. And I think even this current administration...
Yes, the 55(3) that prohibited parties from participating, I think it was an ideological and political thinking that drove it more. But sometimes you can also argue because at that point, Rawlings was more a nation builder, the methods may be criticized, but he saw Ghanaians and he saw Ghana much more than he saw this region and that. And he didn't, if you saw many of the decisions he took. And that is also what we found about leaders like Nkrumah and all that. But I think what was fundamental is that you may make assumptions, that some of which may reflect your values. But over time, you see whether it's working or not. And I think in 2010, when the CRC went, the whole country, it was a very inclusive process. They came to the conclusion that National Development Planning Plan and a state agency that could deliver it without discrimination. But two, they also concluded that people did not therefore then also automatically say that decentralized power to the district. So it was for them to handle that. How did they handle that? There was what was called the compromise, that what gave us to the 1992 Constitution for the Fourth Republic. There were those who were very adamant that there should be no parties in local government. And then there were those, but both sides agreed, the leaders of both sides, that multi-party must be introduced, but confined to parliament and the presidency. You see?
Yeah.
So no parties in. Now, 30 years on, whatever the reasons were, the results show that it didn't work. It hasn't worked. And we believe strongly that the empirical evidence, and indeed in some of the books that I have read and talking to the authors of the 1992 Constitution, the late Justice Annan, P.V. Obeng, and Obeda Samuel and others, they will tell you that there was a certain compromise. They knew that they were going to experiment if the exclusion of parties in local government would really lead to the transformation they needed. That's one. And two, they also believed strongly that it was a compromise that would change at some point. You know, that there would be change. If it didn't work, people would demand, because Ghanaians were becoming more conscious of their right and demanding it. And so up to that point and where we are now, I think we've gotten into a juncture where people really think, if you look at voting patterns in local elections, the majority of voters, you know, are youth. Chiefs influence their communities a lot. The parties are not in local government, they are in national elections, so people vote to reflect. But we've also seen that where we are today, the expectation, the assumption, the theory that this excluding people from local government, the parties especially, would mean that our political leaders will work together and develop the country rapidly and so on, hasn't worked. So I think we should go with the science of a belief that is put to the test, and then that proves after 20 or 30 years that it's not what the people want. So the people speak their mind and so on.
Within which period is it appropriate for us to check the review or the feedback or the effects of what has been practiced? If we're having the Constitution, is it 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to see whether this has worked or has? That's just a short question. I mean,
No,
because
I don't
sometimes
think
it's
there
just
is-
a waste of time just to get to the end of the period to realize that this was really a waste of time.
Well, there's no legally or constitutionally mandated period
Right.
for reviewing the
Right.
Constitution.
And when he was talking, I was also
Yeah.
considering the Singaporean approach, which we have always compared Ghana to, maybe because of the relationship Nkrumah had with Lee Kuan Yew, the suggestions he had given him, and even the benefits that we had also gotten. We don't know if there's any similarities. I think they practice the unitary parliamentary states type of governance. Yeah, I don't know if that's...
Well, you should ask the expert on comparative
On
politics.
governance.
Yeah.
Coups, the resistance, the political forces within Ghana historically have always been confrontational to each other. There's resistance. Colonialism was resisted. There was a fight towards independence, very serious fight, even before the referendum and then the new constitution was adopted, and so on. So we are very dynamic, very strong-willed, with clear values. How do you create a system that, irrespective or in spite of these differences and of culture, power, history, and so on, how do we conceive a nation that we all belong to and we all work together in transforming economically, politically? I think our philosophers really didn't spend too much time on it, because I think it requires a sustained work with evidence showing that certain assumptions are not what they thought, people's thinking and what they needed. So they said, look, people will not vote out Rawlings, or Rawlings will stay. It didn't happen. They said NDC thought it would stay in power because it would be controlling the districts. It didn't happen. And when NPP came and saw that, oh, the district is actually the power base of the governing party, they also wanted to keep it. Because that concentration of power undermined not only our democracy, but the delivery of development. So CRC then looked at how, they call it the constitution, their findings, that from political, to developmental constitution. And they argue that the way the structures were set up and so on is not giving us the development we need. It's very political. You've excluded this group, you excluded that, you only work with your party people and the institutions you want to control. Every government that came in the Fourth Republic wanted to control the public institutions. The police, look at the police, and the police have suffered most. Under the two parties, But if you look at the army, Rawlings made some reforms that gave the army a certain measure of autonomy and how they make decisions collegially and so on. But the police, the Ministry of Interior could. Look at the membership of the board of the police.
The council.
The council, and so on. So we've made mistakes, but every nation makes mistakes. It's how we learn from those mistakes and our willingness and ability to reform so that we can move closer to the goals we want. I think that is where we are. The constraint for the CRC is that the NDC did not give it the space it needed to really look at how the system could be reformed in terms of local government. You see, there were all sorts of resistance by those we call the cadres in the NDC who liked more participatory. They talked about participatory democracy much more than liberal democracy. And those were strong forces too. But
I remember Professor Kwame Nkrumah's arguments.
Yes, but at this time, we have enough evidence to show that we can open up the system. CRC said it was for Ghanaians to determine the kind of local government system, whether it should be by parties or whatever. I think the evidence is that the no-party system has failed. You could tell by votes. Consistently, they vote less, 30%, if you got 33. The highest was 40% or so, close to that, I think, in 2019 or 2015, when Charlotte, or say, yes. But otherwise, it's always between 35 and below, and so on. And when you ask the people, CDD surveys, they ask, why are you not voting? They tell you that the local government system does not work. And when they are in need, they go to the priests, the chiefs, they don't go to the parties. So we are in a very difficult situation now. That's why we think we should open the system to the parties. And rather, what we should do is to put the institutions that are required to regulate parties after elections when they take state power and they have access to state resources, so that they use the taxpayers' money for what it is. And if they do wrong, they are called to attention.
Josba agrees 100%.
Okay.
Yes, but let me have Doctor come in. I was speaking with an MP yesterday or so, 3 days ago, who was mentioning some problems in his constituency and how the locals will come straight to the MP without recognizing assemblyman, DC, the whole local government is struck out. It's the MP or no one. So I bear with your pain.
Or priests. The churches. And then the chiefs.
Yes.
They came in the category.
Right, so you can take up some of the issues that we've come. I think he has situated it in a broader perspective.
The historical and philosophical context of why we concentrate power in the executive branch of government.
Yes.
That is well said. But I think that we should look specifically at the 1992 Constitution, because that is the document we are celebrating today. That for 30 years has been the basis of our exercise of governmental power. As I said earlier, one of the birth defects that has been identified, by legal experts, political scientists, and so on, is this issue of the all-powerful executive. But Annie, sometimes when you ask people specifically what is, wrong with the arrangements relating to executive power. All right. The example they give you is in relation to appointments. That the president appoints from messenger to minister. He appoints everybody. And that by reason of the appointment, the president controls the system. And I think the example that you gave yourself is that of the IGP, right? That he appoints the IGP, and because he appoints the IGP, if there's something wrong in the system, and then the IGP has to act, right? For instance, arrest a minister who has committed a crime, or a party operative who has committed a crime, and so on. The IGP may be a bit reluctant to do so, given the fact that such an arrest may have some adverse consequences when it comes to his continued, stay in power. But you see, I think that this is not the fault of the Constitution, because in the United States of America, the same powers are vested in the president. The president appoints, everybody from messenger to minister. Mm-hmm. All the secretaries, the undersecretaries, agency heads, and so on are appointed by the president. In their case, for the agency heads, for instance, they have to go for confirmation hearings. And so if you go before the Senate and you cannot prove that you are up to the task, and the Senate rejects you,
that's it.
The president, will normally, all right, not renominate you. Okay, there will be very few occasions.
So it's not necessarily a full concentration of power.
Right. I'm just giving this as an example of how expansive the checks and balances are in the United States. Because here, the president can appoint the GMPC CEO without parliamentary approval. He can appoint the NPA CEO without parliamentary approval. But in the EPA, chief executive can also be appointed without parliamentary approval. But in the US, okay, that cannot happen. They have to go for confirmation, hearings before the Senate. And the point is that the Constitution itself has got its own internal checks and balances when it comes to the exercise of governmental power. The problem is that the operators of the Constitution, as well as the citizens, have not taken those checks and balances very seriously. All right, so the example of appointments, if you check Article 195 of the Constitution, the president appoints, the officers of the public service, okay? Some of them are subject to Public Service Commission, clearance and so on, all right? However, Article 195(2) is very clear that the president can delegate the power of appointment, okay? Except with President Rawlings, no president has ever delegated the power of appointment under 195, okay? Under President Rawlings, there were instances where ministers signed the letters of appointment of agency heads, okay?
That used to be the practice. Actually.
That used to be the practice. It was a practice that was carried over from the PNDC days, okay? But after President, in fact, even in President Rawlings' case, during the second term, he signed, he got the chief of staff to sign the letters of appointment of most of the agency heads, So that delegation, was not done during the second term.
So I was trying to go through the 195(2), right?
Yes.
It says that the president may, subject to such conditions as he may think fit, delegate some of his functions under the article by council, by directions in writing to the governing council concerned, or to a committee of council, or to any member of the governing council, or to any public officer.
All right. So if you, for instance, have the Ghana, you want to appoint the Director General of the Ghana Health Services, all right? You have the Ghana Health Service, council, okay? The president can delegate the power of appointment to the council. And then, subject to set conditions as you will spell out in the instrument delegating his powers to them, to appoint the Director General.
Okay, but the power still lies with the president, whether or not.
Yeah, it still lies with the president. But I believe that when it is delegated, right, there will be some difference in terms of how the appointment is done. Okay, so that is the point that I'm trying to make. But the broader point that I made earlier, which is, the position that I've always held, is that we have checks on the powers of the president. Okay, these checks, okay, are rarely exercised. Okay, or let me say, in the case of Parliament, for instance, the president brings, his budget through his Minister of Finance. Okay, and continuously, whatever is demanded in the budget is approved for the president. Okay, the president makes nominations of appointees, whether you are talking about justices of the Supreme Court, you are talking about ministers and deputy ministers and so on. Okay, and we rarely exercise the power of scrutiny to reject those appointees. Okay, even some of them who have obvious deficiencies, they cannot even articulate any policy position with respect to the, let's say, in the case of ministers.
Why is it so difficult for you to do that?
Well, for me, I mean, over the years that I have been in Parliament, what I think, is wrong with us is the deep-seated partisanship.
Yeah.
That is the bane of Ghana politics, the deep-seated partisanship. So you find a situation where, whether it is the NDC or the MPP, we take the view that, okay, rejecting the president's nominee from your own party is a no-go area. Because when you do that, you disgrace the president, you disgrace the party, and so on. And that is
so for you, it's party first, president first.
So that is the operating principle.
Right.
Okay, so your leadership.
And you're happy with that?
No, I am not happy with that as an individual.
Okay.
Okay, but generally, that is the operating principle. Okay, so you have caucus meetings where discussions are held, and of course, we need to, make sure we don't disgrace the president, because if this nominee is rejected,
statement is funny.
So those are some of the things that draw us back as a country. Okay, I remember distinctly, and I hope I don't get into trouble for saying this, but I remember distinctly that there was a certain appointment that was made, and I watched it on TV, and I actually called the secretary to the president and I said, what the hell are we doing appointing this person as a minister? Okay? His response was very simple. If you know the number of chiefs and opinion leaders who came to put pressure on the president for this person to be appointed, you will not be asking that question. So my hope was that Parliament would have said no. Okay? I made inquiries in Parliament, and again, was that, look, we cannot reject the person, because if we do, that will be a slap in the face to the President of the Republic. So it is not just I don't think that the fault lies in the Constitution. The fault lies in the way we have operationalized the Constitution. We have...
Yes, but we're saying, that's why we're saying that for 30 years, the people have grown to a certain point where they've seen, if we want, or we're giving you the power to exercise your willpower, and you're refusing to do that, then we'll have to change what we've written.
No, yeah. So the question then becomes, okay, what shall we take away from the current arrangement that will make it, possible for us to get optimal results? Okay, what shall we take away? And if you ask legal scholars, you ask political scientists, they will not be able to tell you anything that will be taken away as far as the current arrangement is concerned.
I can tell you.
Okay, please do.
You see, these assumptions of the president being very powerful and he could utilize, sometimes concentration of power paralyzes the person, because this is what it attracts. A decision that the president could make easily, looking at qualification, information given to, they do intelligence on people, and straight away, in a certain socio-cultural context, becomes difficult because they do not share the values of the president wanting the best person who can deliver results that he wants. But not picking those that the community wants could cost you votes, and so on and so forth. But why design a system that enables
that
yeah,
process.
this corrupt way of voting and
Right.
so on and so
Okay,
forth.
so you see, there are best practices elsewhere, that, and I mean, I've been discussing it with some of my colleagues. So, for instance, when it comes to the appointment of judges, okay, in our, current arrangement, the president nominates a Supreme Court judge or a Supreme Court justice, and then the person is approved by Parliament, right? Now, this could lead to a situation, of abuse if, for instance, the president's party is dominant in Parliament. I mean, currently, with the 137, we've been able to, for instance, withhold 2, Supreme Court appointments. The appointments committee was split. They were brought to the floor, and a vote could not be taken because there was a shortfall on the majority side. Okay, so most likely the report will be brought back. All right, but what has happened in the Kenyan case is a case in point of best practice that we could emulate. So, for instance, in Kenya, the president nominates. Oh no, I think the Judicial Commission.
Yeah.
Okay, the Judicial Commission.
First.
All right, first interviews. Screens.
Exactly.
Screens.
Publicly.
Publicly.
Public.
Okay. So you want to be CJ, the Chief Justice of Kenya, you have to appear before the Judicial, Appointments Commission. All right. You go through an interview. A process. You are grilled publicly, and then subsequently, they shortlist those who have the candidates. Who have done well, and let's say the top candidate,
Right.
like the current, Chief Justice, is sent to the appointment. To the president for
Presidency.
appointment, and he
Yes.
cannot reject.
No.
The recommendation of
Which has been suggested in Ghana. I think
no,
we were.
I'm just simply saying that is the way to go when it comes to
Yeah, but I'm saying that there's been suggestions that
Oh, okay.
with the appointment of the Chief Justice,
Okay.
we should also consider involving the Ghana Bar Association.
No.
and
The
other-
bar is actually involved in a way because
Yes.
the bar is has
recommendation.
membership of the Judicial Council.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
But the Judicial Council only exercises an advisory, role when it comes to appointments, and the advice, according to the Supreme Court, is not binding on the president. So whatever advice they give, the president could simply ignore that advice and go ahead and make the
See,
appointment.
but this is also the Ghana problem. In the Kenyan case, which, Kenya is a tougher patrimonial and patronage system than this. But when they introduced this system to convince the public the objectivity, you're competent, you're valid. The current Chief Justice was never thought to be the person who would emerge.
Yes.
And it's 2 times. There was also this man, the first, what was he called?
Yes. The one who
forgotten-
used to wear
yes,
earrings.
earrings
Yes,
and so on. By dressing alone.
Yes. Yes.
But they couldn't disqualify him.
They couldn't disqualify him. Yes.
So why don't we introduce that system here? Because this cronyism, it's all over the place.
Right.
And we need to do something about it because it's not helping with our development.
Right. We had a few minutes extra. So, okay, Lance, and then...
Joyce will come in. I also wanted to comment on something that the Honorable Joyce Bauer has, emphasized. That is Article 71. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that Article 71 is one of the very horrible birth defects of our current constitution. All right. So I agree
So
with
she
all
was right to say you were conflicted.
Well, yes, because I'm a beneficiary of
Actually, he
Article 71.
donates the money.
So,
You could have done that.
I'm a beneficiary of Article 71, but I think that it could have been better. You see, sometimes it is also the way we operationalize constitutional provisions that creates the problem. So Article 71 says that in the case of members of parliament, the president should establish a committee, on emoluments, that will make recommendations to the president for his approval of the emoluments and other benefits of members of parliament. What has happened since President Rawlings, since January 1993, is that usually this is done as, as post facto. All right, so you have a situation where the committee is not established until the last minute in the 4th year of the life of a parliament. All right. Now, the committee is set up somewhere in October of that last year, and then it has to hurriedly put together its recommendations to the president. And because the committee's recommendations come after members of parliament have served their term, then there are two elements to the work of the committee. One relates to salary arrears, and then two relates to the so-called ex gratia or end of service benefits. Okay? When the two are put together, then the sum becomes so outrageous that ordinary citizens begin to wonder why members of parliament are being paid such huge sums of money, at the end of their term. But it is because of the way the provision is operationalized. If I were to do it, I would, set up that committee in February of the first, year of the life of a parliament, and get that, the recommendation of the emoluments of members of parliament sorted out from day one, so that at the end of the day, okay, even if arrears will be paid, those arrears will be limited to a few months of their service in office. Okay, so that the arrears component of the ESB, of the Article 71 emoluments is taken out. Okay, because it's also a matter of public perception. If, for instance, in the last one, I can say this publicly, all right? My salary arrears came to 241,000, okay, Ghana cedis. Now, there was a tax element because I was paid through controller and accountant general. Controller took out 135,000 in taxes, all right? Ordinary people didn't know that I have been taxed 135,000 Ghana cedis. They are
Metro TV, insightful and inspiring moments.
Welcome to the 7th edition of the Total Energies African Nations Championships Algeria Chan 2023. Starting January 13th, 18 top African soccer nations will battle it out.
MPs are definitely, and I'll come to the issue of justices of the Superior Court. MPs are definitely entitled to some form of end of service benefits or pension. Okay, so that but the way it is structured becomes problematic. If, for instance, you are returning to parliament, who gets paid a pension, that is a retirement benefit, and then returns to work? That doesn't happen. But we could have a committee that would recommend to the president that, all right, for returning parliamentarians, okay, there should be no terminal benefits.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. So
they should work towards earning a pension if, for instance, they do 3 terms in parliament, then cumulatively, they could be paid a pension at the end of the 3 terms. In the UK, for instance, I checked that the last time. Okay, the MPs are paid a pension. All right, they are entitled to a pension, and you can contribute either 1/40%. 1/40 of your salary. Okay, up to 1/60. Okay, and that constitutes something like the maximum is about 7.9% of your gross goes into your pension. So we are entitled to, some form of terminal benefits. But the way it is done is what, becomes a problem. And now, for instance, when it comes to some of the Article 71 office holders, like judges, okay, the judges are entitled the same way as MPs. So every 4 years, okay, they do have ex gratia. Now that is absurd because they serve for a very long time and retire on their salary. It doesn't make sense for us to be paying justices of the Superior Court. With all due respect to them, justices of the Superior Court, ex gratia, every 4 years.
4 years.
Even though they continue to be in public office.
Their system is quite different.
Yeah, so it is the way the committee, the Emoluments Committee, makes its recommendations. It's a blanket recommendation for all Article 71 office holders. And, because of that, every one of them will be entitled to ex gratia, salary arrears, and so on at the end of every 4 years. We need to reform that system.
So we're far behind time, but I will have you maybe shortchange you a little, if you may. Yes.
And of course,
let's
very
wrap up.
quickly, I think that everything that we need to say has actually been said. But the question I ask is it an antiquated constitution? Is it a constitution that has long outlived its usefulness? Should we therefore just dump it, put it in the bin, move on, and get a new constitution? You know, it is a fantastic document. It has served a fantastic purpose. But when you listen to the two panelists, you can see that in quoting from Article 55(3), Article 195(2), Chapter 6 of the Constitution itself on directive state principles of what the state policy and protection of rights, even basic protection of human rights. And I don't even want to come to the subject of gender, so when it has to do with women and children. That is a whole new ballgame. And note that all through the engagements by the CRC, nowhere did any debate lead to a conversation about anything to do with gender or children whatsoever. None. Not surprising. So that tells you that even from the days of the poll tax as far back as 1852, where it failed for the reasons that we still discuss today, lack of accountability, transparency, communication, accountability, name it. The interesting thing about what has happened now is that society is more dynamic. There's so much research, there's so much out there. Take the example of the stolen verdict in 1992. As soon as those reforms were made and things settled down, I think that is what has led us to this duopolistic system that we are refusing even to move away from. And it is the same duopoly that has actually resulted also in this overly partisan atmosphere that now has annihilated any voices of dissent. So you no longer have independent candidates. The smaller political parties that actually used to help either of these two to a successful election have been totally annihilated and silenced. So wherein lies the voice of reason that in the past would call on either of these parties or even stand forth to disagree with any of them? Go to jurisprudence, go to the case law regarding the Constitution and every amendment to do with same. They are always along the same duopoly and the same partisanship, to do with elections, to do with petitions, to do with results. It is always fighting for power for one or other of the political parties, nothing more. So what happens to all those in the middle with no representation whatsoever? I still believe, I may be naive in this regard, that there are still some Ghanaians who are truly apolitical, who genuinely only live to benefit from what good policies would benefit them, who genuinely believe in objectivity to the point where they would want what is best for the middle level too. Apart from that, ask, when Obama arrived here, what did he say? Build strong institutions, not strong men. So I love the example that Dr. Ayine gave, that in those countries that we love to quote from copiously, and I believe Dr. Akwete said the same, it is the fact that they have strong institutions. Institutions that are built on a certain lack of political interference, where people believe that the separation of powers works without any underhand, lobbying or heavy-handedness whatsoever. In this country, for example, at the peak of deep divisions, even in Parliament, at the peak of cases that had a tendency to divide us, we hear about what? Political interference, heavy-handedness of a certain form. So there is that suspicion. And most of the reasons why we are here is because there's a deep-seated suspicion for all three arms of government. And maybe, just maybe, a new constitution might seek to satisfy this new demographic. But if you ask me from a very personal perspective, let's focus more on building strong institutions, an executive devoid of unnecessary heavy-handedness, a judiciary free from interference, and a parliament that is strong enough to exercise the supervisory responsibility that it has. I think for the judiciary, they have some problems, but they've done their very best. And I've seen a report from IDEG, from CDD, many others. Beyond the suspicions, they have actually stayed the course. And maybe some credit about the success of this particular constitution ought also to to be given to the judiciary.
Right. I'm being pressed to end because we have some extra time.
Just a quick point. To Joyce's, which is a very insightful and brilliant contribution. I think that development is an experiment, okay? And you must establish facts that leads you to truth. What do you do? So we need to have institutions. There is no democracy today, whether it's in the West or maybe principally developing countries, even China, which is predominantly a one-party state. Members of the civil service do not belong to the Communist Party.
Yeah.
You compete, and the competition in India, to be a civil servant and the competency required. You mentioned Singapore. If you listen to Lee Kuan Yew and the current Prime Minister, they talk about the integrity of the public service.
Yes. Yep.
It's a country where you write exams almost every year until you get to principal, secretary, or whatever, and you stop. And when you fail, you go out. So your competence, your merit, your ability to serve the people and the philosophies and so on, they are well paid, but not the best paid above everybody. And we are not making anything to shift away. I think corruption has entered into how we run our institutions. The police, the public service are institutions of the state. And no politician should tell somebody, take this guy out, I want my person to come in. So the partisan thing has affected our institutions. The reforms needed to change this are also on the table. We for instance, think that political parties must have a state agency looking at their post-election behavior. And if you allow parties in local government, as it happens in other places, you're going to create institutions, okay, that would also ensure that they would not, to be a civil servant, the civil service belongs to the state, not a party. A party cannot remove this person. And recently in the UK, the Home Office, the lady Patel tried to sack some people and bring party, and the chief director said, no, you can't. I discovered that following it actively, there is more or less a commission or a court of a sort
That determines.
That determines and protects the civil service. The party does not. But here, if you talk to the past Public Service Commission chairpersons and so on, they will tell you the pressure exerted on them, take this person out. And sometimes it's so silly because they suspect you belong to that party. Or you work closely to with the former who was this, so your competence and so on. So there are a lot of things we can do to change the system. I do not subscribe to an entirely new constitution because I think our experiences enrich and inform our decisions going forward. And therefore, we should think through those lines and build strong institutions, even as we do politics.
Right. So I'm sure the production team will help us, create another platform for us to get more into discussions of this nature. Then we can also inform policy decisions. It's quite important. But this has been good. Thank you so much to my guests. I've had Dr. Emmanuel Akote, who is Executive Director for Institute of Democratic Governance, IDEC. Also, Dr. Dominic Ayeni, MP, and at both Gatanga East as well, also former Attorney General, and also Joyce Bahamutari, who is a lawyer and aide to former President John Dramani Mahama. Apologies for the inability for Professor Bafo Ajimandia, governance experts who have joined us. I'm sure we'll check on him later why that was impossible.
Why was he intimidated by my presence or what? Please ask him.
I'll ask him.
He's my very good friend.
I'll provide feedback.
But I'm sure he thought you could do a good job. But to leave you to
but Joyce's full qualifications you haven't mentioned. You want me
I'm restricted.
You are restricted.
Very much so.
Okay.
I'm restricted. Yes, I'm still on air. But some of you have sent messages. It's actually feedback that this has been very good to you. Some of your messages are full thesis. But because of that, I cannot read all of
Okay.
that. Yeah, a lot of messages, but long messages. It tells you that you have an interest of really this constitution at heart, and you should continue to share them. We will share them on our social media pages so that it will be duly captured by the authorities that matter, especially on this subject. Thank you to my guest again. My name is Ania Fompofu. This has been the Constitution Day Forum here on Metro TV. We will do this again, but the Nteme Review is coming up with another live program. So enjoy the holidays, stay safe. Tomorrow we're coming to work, so get ready for that. All right, good afternoon.
Okay, great.